Good afternoon, everybody, and a really warm welcome to this seminar. My name's Sarah Thornton. For those of you who have not met, I'm the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and I'm really pleased to welcome you, both the speakers and the participants, to this event, which we are hosting jointly with the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre. The title is Working Collaboratively to Maximise the Impact of Modern Slavery Research. And our plan basically is to examine just how much research has been changing, how the landscape has been developing, but in particular to focus on the real practical efforts that are being made to bridge that gap between modern slavery research and policy and practice. Certainly we had over 100 people from the sector, including academics, policymakers, practitioners, businesses and survivors, who had registered to come, and I think looking at the attendance, a lot of you have joined us, so you're very, very welcome. In a minute, I'm going to launch a brief interactive survey, so hopefully you can participate in that way, which is just testing out the question about what you think the barriers are to impact for modern slavery research. This is an issue which Juliana Rinaldi Simeoni examined in her work, which we published last year. So the idea is you just rate the top barriers, and we will share the results later on, just before the Q&A. Hopefully I'll remember to do that. If you are a Twitter person and keen on tweeting, we are using a social media hashtag preparing for impact, and linked to that, we've decided to hold this event on the record, so it's a resource for people in the future. We will publish the video and the slides, and we'll also publish a note from the event. So I've got lots of brilliant speakers and panelists, but when they have finished, we are going to be super strict with timing, and we will have a decent amount of time for Q&A. So please submit your questions in the Q&A function. I think there's an option to do that anonymously if you prefer. I would prefer it if you did it in the Q&A function rather than the chat function, because then I only have to look at one area. But please, if you can think of questions, please send them, and we will do our best to ask colleagues. So at that point, Jessica, can you launch the interactive survey, please?
That has now been launched.
Thank you. And I see I'm not allowed to vote, so I will delete it. But please, participants, it's very much for you to vote. And while you're doing that, I am going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Juliana Rinaldi Simeoni. Juliana is a research fellow at the Nottingham Rights Lab, and she's their lead in survivor engagement and policy impact. And she's going to talk for 10 minutes about the shifting landscape, particularly since the research report she published last year. And if you haven't seen that report, it was called Preparing for Impact: How We Can Overcome Barriers and Cultivate a Culture of Collaboration, Understanding and Respect to Achieve Impact on Survivor Support. So Juliana, great to see you again, and I'll hand over to you, and you're very welcome.
Thanks very much. And hi, everybody. It's really good to be here with you. I'm just going to share my screen very briefly. I'm always faster than the tech. That's what I like to say the problem is. There we go. Hopefully you're able to see that now. So essentially, I have been asked today to speak about the shifting landscape, which is a section of my report that Dame Sarah just referred to. And I've been asked to share a bit about not only how that shifting landscape was presented in the report, but how it has shifted for us since the report was written. And I've also been asked to introduce the barriers to impact that you saw during that quiz. So we've got 6 main barriers to impact that were identified. I'm not going to go into great detail about these today because I want to spend the majority of my time on the shifting landscape. But each of these are given a couple of pages worth of space in the report itself. And they're also each given real life case studies coming from a total of about 93 practitioners, researchers, and other stakeholders in the anti-slavery sector. And so these are barriers that a lot of us experience regardless of what our role is, regardless of whether we are evidence users or evidence producers, as it were. Access, that barrier is all really about how we get research or how we don't get research. So is access to research easy for people outside the academic circles? Feasibility is really a comment around recommendations. So feasibility is a barrier to impact if recommendations that are made in research are not realistic, or if they're not feasible for people who will be reading and trying to implement the research. Funding is all about the ability to do research in the first place, so that financial backing of research, the availability of funds, but it's also about funding for post-research activities and the ability or inability for research teams and external stakeholders to carry on the impact of the work after the actual research is completed. Preconceptions is something we're going to come back to today, talking about the shifting landscape, but that's all about how we perceive one another across sectors and even within sectors. The report talks about preconceptions that evidence users have about one another, or I'm sorry, about researchers, and preconceptions that researchers have about evidence users. Relevance is all about whether or not research is relevant to the people on the ground. So are the people creating the research writing things and researching questions that are actually useful and relevant to the people who will then use the published research in a perfect world? It obviously won't be used if it's not relevant. And finally, time. Time is a really precious commodity to most of us. And so time is often a very limiting factor in terms of whether or not we are able to follow through on impact activities or implement any recommendations that are made in research. Now, the report found that crucially, all of these barriers are important to try and overcome, and there are examples in the report of overcoming them, but we still can't achieve impact if we don't have collaboration, understanding, and respect for one another. So I'm going to ask you to indulge my non-existent digital art skills here, but this is an image that will be familiar to my NSPEC colleagues on the call. And basically, it's just a visualization that we've got those of us who are trying to not only create, but use research. We're that group of people on the left-hand side. And those barriers that I just named, they stand between us and impact. But impact, even in the absence of those barriers, would still be unattainable to us if we did not build upon collaboration, understanding, and respect for one another to get there. So it's just a really crucial message that comes out of the report, is that not only are there practical ways through these shared barriers, but we have to have those three core values, or we are still not going to realize impact. Nobody's going to benefit from research. So I want to talk a bit about this shifting landscape and what is it? What is this shifting landscape exactly? In the report, it refers to the context that we work in and how there are a few moving objects, as it were, in the landscape that affect a lot of us in the anti-slavery sector. And it's not just about survivor support in this presentation, but I'm going to give an example that comes from the report to start with. But basically, we've got these moving objects that are inextricably connected to our anti-slavery work. We have to work in reference to them. We have to work in light of them. Sometimes we have to work because of them. And so in other words, the anti-slavery world is just prone to change. And that can actually exacerbate the barriers that I've just named. It can make those barriers even more difficult to overcome. And in some cases, the shifting landscape itself might create barriers for researchers working on a specific project, or for evidence users trying to solve a specific problem or deliver a specific service, as it were. So for example, the national referral mechanism is one that's mentioned in the report. And the national referral mechanism is one of those moving objects on our anti-slavery landscape. So modern slavery research and a lot of service provision is carried out in light of the NRM or directly in response to the NRM. And the shifting landscape around this is neither good nor bad, because changes to the NRM and changes to any other part of our anti-slavery landscape can be good, They can be bad, they can be neutral. Change itself in the landscape isn't bad, it's just a feature of the landscape. But the NRM itself, to keep on our example, is a policy mechanism that's designed and overseen by the Home Office, and it provides services and support to victims of modern slavery in the UK. So the NRM is reformed and altered from time to time, and that means that one piece of research that's written about the NRM or that talks about the NRM might mean something very different when it uses the term NRM than another piece of research that came after it, because the NRM itself changes nature. So that exacerbates the barrier of relevance, for example. So it's not necessarily that that earlier research isn't useful or isn't of high quality. It's just that it might not seem relevant, or that researchers might have to work harder to make it relevant, make it seem relevant. Thank you, Olivia. So basically, we are going to talk about some other things that shift in the landscape. And we've got the idea basically that not only do we have a shifting anti-slavery landscape around issues like the NRM or many other anti-slavery issues that we talk about, but we've also got shifts in other spaces that we occupy in our work. So a lot of us have one foot in the anti-slavery space. We also have a foot in another world. So we might have a foot in the practitioner world, or you might have a foot in the business world, et cetera, et cetera. And I know a lot of you on this call come from very different sectors. And so you might find that you've got one foot in a sector that comes up later from one of the other presenters. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how the anti-slavery landscape has shifted since the report was written. And there are lots of examples that could be found from across sectors. But I also want to talk about a couple positive examples. I'll also bring up a couple sort of more negative examples. And the first example is positive, and it's around survivor engagement. So as I talk to colleagues, and just as I've been observing in my impact role in the Rights Lab, how the anti-slavery landscape has changed since the report was published, I found that actually the stuff in the report does resonate with lots of people, and there's some new changes that would be included if we were to write that report this year. One of those is that there is greater survivor engagement. So we have actually a greater degree of survivor engagement in research itself and in the creation of research. And that is largely because we've had this normalized expectation and stated value for a long time that survivors be meaningfully involved in research. But over time, including the last year, slightly more than a year since the release of the report now, we've actually had more examples of survivor engagement. And so we've got more examples of how this can be done well. We've learned some lessons about how to do it better. We've had some mistakes that we don't want to repeat. Those of us in the research world can probably point at things we did well and less well as we've learned to engage survivors. But survivor engagement is a really big deal. And we've got lots of good examples of it now. Part of that is actually a positive outcome of COVID-19, because the COVID-19 pandemic sparked a lot of research around the impact of COVID-19 on various aspects of modern slavery and our world. And so a lot of those research pieces actually involve survivors in meaningful ways. And so if there's a handful of good things to come out of the pandemic, one of them for our sector is that it's resulted in some good examples of meaningful survivor engagement. The Modern Slavery Strategy Review, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Damian, who's speaking later, may speak to this a bit, but the Home Office is reviewing the modern slavery strategy, thinking about what it looks like going forward. And depending on what it does look like going forward and how different it is from our current strategy, we might end up seeing that as a piece of the shifting landscape that moves how we think about modern slavery and how we work in our world. And the Nationality and Borders Bill, I will also mention, that is still going through the Lords and the Commons. And so that will, in its current iteration, it will legislatively wed modern slavery and immigration issues in a way that is not yet reality in the UK, but that we know is reality a lot of times in how we talk about immigration and modern slavery together. A big difference if the bill is passed in its current iteration will be that those two things are legislatively linked. And finally, we have a shifting landscape around COVID-19, and not everything that's come out of it is positive, but there are some positives, as I said before. There's other positives about greater collaboration opportunities around virtual remote working and the ability to connect with one another in ways that we've not been able to before, in ways that were not precedented before. But it also has left our entire world, of which the anti-slavery landscape is a space, And it's left us in a place where we're not sure what the long-term effects are, health-wise or otherwise, and what COVID-19 means for us as society, how we relate to one another, how we prioritize resources, including funding, etc. So I'll close with a comment on the importance of collaboration and what this means for us in the anti-slavery space. With a shifting landscape, collaboration is ever more important, because when we work together, we all benefit from one another's different perspectives. We all benefit from the vantage point that one another has on the shifting landscape. And the more collaboratively we can work, the more respectfully we can work, and the better we can understand each other, the more of the landscape we can build a view of in our work, because we're borrowing from everyone else's vantage points and expertise. Thank you.
Juliana, thank you so much for that. And not only a refresh on your work from last year, which I think is remarkably relevant, but also bringing us a bit up to date. Thank you, really, really useful. And now one of the things that has really changed, I think, in the last 18 months is the role of the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre. And I'm really pleased that Olivia Hesketh, who's the Director of Policy Impact, and Dr. Alex Belch, who's the Director of Research, are now going to do a bit of a double act and talk a little bit about their experience and their learning from the way in which the Peck is beginning to facilitate policy impactful research. So over to you, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. So Alex and I wanted to spend a little bit of time setting out the Modern Slavery PEC's vision for maximising the impact of modern slavery research, and share with you some of the work that we've done over the last year or so towards this. Before we go into that, I'll just give a very brief overview of the Modern Slavery PEC. So the PEC was initiated following an investment of £10 million from UK Research and Innovation through the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and we were formally launched in September 2020. The centre is a consortium of 6 different universities and independent research organisations led by the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, which is where a small core team of Modern Slavery PEC staff is based. The centre was set up really with a twofold mission. So firstly, to enhance the understanding of modern slavery across the globe, and secondly, to transform the effectiveness of laws and policies designed to address modern slavery. And we do this by funding new, impartial, high quality research into modern slavery to fill priority evidence gaps, and also promoting the uptake of that evidence in policymaking and lawmaking on modern slavery. Policy impact is a really central thread running through all of our work, which is why we are really pleased to be co-hosting today's event with the Commissioner. I'll hand over to Alex now.
Olivia, yeah, so what have we done? Well, since 2020, we've generated a portfolio of high quality funded research which fills evidence gaps and is informed by survivors. So our vision is to fund projects across 4 different areas: survivor support, prevention, supply chains and legal enforcement, and to meet priority evidence gaps and to do research that is more rigorous, that has high quality outputs, but is also more diverse in terms of those people involved in the research. So to date, we've funded 24 different projects, and we have several more calls in process. We prioritise through a consultation process with the sector, so that's helped inform our research priorities, but it's also helped us to develop principles that guide our research, and that is a focus on effectiveness, or what works, but also equity and survivor involvement. So we implement those principles in the way that we actually fund the research. And of course, the challenge then is to increase the sort of conditions of our research funding while maintaining independence and allowing people to be innovative and to do interdisciplinary work, while making it necessary for them to collaborate and involve survivor involvement when awarding funding. So it's a challenge, but it's one we think is working well. How do we improve the quality of the research? Here I'd say that the Peck model is actually quite different to the standard funding model, where quality assessment generally is front loaded. It comes at the beginning at selection, and then researchers are generally left to implement the research without that much governance or support. The Peck model has a lot more support for researchers all the way through the research and right through to the final report. So it's really a genuine collaboration. Even if this might sometimes be quite unfamiliar for academics, we think that it's really helping to improve the quality and to make the research more impactful for policy. I'll hand back to Olivia.
Thanks, Alex. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how we in the Modern Slavery PEC promote the uptake of evidence. And our vision here is really that those groups who are involved in policy making and law making on modern slavery know about, understand and use research to inform their decisions about those policies and laws, recognising, of course, that evidence is one of many factors that will be taken into account in making those decisions. So to do this at the Modern Slavery PEC, we really aim to make sure that our whole research portfolio is relevant, timely and accessible to policymakers and lawmakers. And taking each of those three themes in turn, on relevance, we want the research that we fund and commission to really speak to issues that align with priorities for decision makers. So as well as the consultation that Alex mentioned, we also undertake regular engagement with groups such as businesses and policymakers to understand their priorities, particularly with respect to evidence, and ensure that our current and future research portfolio reflects that wider dynamic policy landscape. And as well as the topic of research being relevant to policymakers and lawmakers, we've also seen the importance of focusing on the relevance of research recommendations. And across the projects that we've funded as the Modern Slavery PEC, we've found that research recommendations have the most traction and uptake, where they clearly stem from the evidence that's been generated through the research projects, and where the recommendations are really specific and targeted and have given some consideration to the feasibility of implementation. The second area is around timeliness, and we want the insights from our research to be available at the most appropriate points in the development and implementation of policies and laws on modern slavery. I think timeliness is probably the most challenging area that we've experienced over the last year or so, as there's often quite a tension between how quickly decision makers require evidence and the time that it takes to conduct high quality research. One of the things that we have done is developed a funding mechanism called responsive research, which is around trying to fund slightly more agile, shorter term, targeted and narrow research projects that meet a specific stakeholder need. And we've tried to use that mechanism to try and better align the supply and demand of evidence for decision makers. Also, we found that having the capacity within the small team within the Modern Slavery PEC means that we are able to relatively quickly synthesize existing evidence to inform ongoing policy decisions. So for example, yesterday, the Modern Slavery PEC on our website published a policy briefing which drew on evidence to inform the ongoing development of the Modern Slavery Strategy Review. And finally, on accessibility, we know that policymakers and decision makers are often short on time. So we've really tried to focus our outputs and reports with that in mind. So we support all funded research projects to produce a Peck research summary report, which is really a shortened version of key findings and recommendations, very much tailored and framed to policy audiences. And we also produce Peck policy briefs to synthesize research and produce evidence-informed recommendations for specific targeted groups such as policymakers and businesses. And I would be really interested in hearing later on today from researchers and research users about their experiences of relevance, timeliness and accessibility. But I will hand over to Alex now for some final reflections.
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, just a couple of final thoughts. First of all, it's clear there's a huge demand for research and evidence and lots of great opportunities to match that up and to get impact. But we do feel there's a need for increased and better use of more consistent methods, more transparency about the methods that are used in research. And I think that will help policymakers understand what the strengths and weaknesses are of evidence if we can do a better job of communicating the way that methods are used and how powerful the evidence is. So there's a big opportunity. I think there's also an opportunity for the Peck to help develop an expert consensus about what the future direction should be for policy in this area. So I think it's important that we can build credibility around evidence and expertise to make it more likely that that consensus is something that policymakers can hear and can act upon. That's it for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Olivia and Alex. And Olivia, it was really great to hear kind of you responding on some of those key themes that Juliana had brought out in terms of relevance, timeliness, accessibility. So thank you, really useful session. Now, we're going to have the proof of concept because this is a piece of research which was funded by the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre. And we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Alex Hughes, who is from the University of Newcastle, I think, and Rosie Hurst from Impact Limited. This is a really interesting piece of work on modern slavery in the Malaysian medical gloves factories. It was very much part of the work on the pandemic, and they're going to outline how they designed the research and then thought about impact activities related to that research. So Alex and Rosie, you are really welcome. I think you've got some slides and hopefully Jessica's going to manage those for you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers and to everybody for being here. You know, it's a pleasure for myself and the team to be speaking to you. So this was a project, you know, we're enormously grateful for the funding from the Modern Slavery PEC that you've just heard all about, and through the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It's a collaborative project. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, because that collaboration and the team members was part and parcel of the strategy for engagement and impact. So it's a team of us. You can see the long list of names there. Not everybody's able to be on the call, but you know, I'll be co-presenting, as you've heard, with Rosie Hurst of Impact Limited. So this was a partnership with the ethical trade consultancy Impact, and also between the universities of Newcastle, Sussex and Nottingham. And I've got May Truber and Alex Troutrams, there are many Alexes on the call with me, who may join in Q&A in a moment. So this was a real collaboration, a real team effort. And the project was commissioned by the Modern Slavery PEC to look at the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on supply chains. And our focus was on the supply of Malaysian medical gloves, so part of the personal protective equipment sector, the supply of those gloves to the National Health Service. And we were focused on looking at labour issues, in particular indicators of forced labour in Malaysian medical glove factories. So we can move on to the next slide if that's possible, please. So in a nutshell, we were looking at the scale of forced labour, both before, but particularly during the pandemic, and very much trying to identify opportunities for positive change to sort of prevent and remediate labour problems. And as you can see, I focused on this particular sector. So if we move on. And just to really pull out some key findings, because I want to spend more of the time focused on our strategy for engagement and impact and what worked for us as a project. But just to give you some insight into the key findings, we saw that a significant increase in demand for medical gloves during the pandemic led to shifts in the operation of that supply chain. And a shift in power towards the manufacturers, increased pressure on workers, and also reduced opportunities for ethical procurement. Using the International Labour Organization 11 indicators of forced labour as a framework, we found evidence of all of those sort of forced labour indicators. And in fact, a key point coming out of the research was the endemic nature of forced labour in this sector. So it wasn't just something that was caused by the pandemic. Nonetheless, we saw 4 areas where conditions for workers worsened, and that was around restriction on movement, perhaps unsurprisingly, isolation, abusive working and living conditions, and excessive overtime that was very much linked to that increased pressure on production and the workforce. So this ongoing presence of these labour issues really demonstrates a need for policy change, for shifting legislation, and better approaches to addressing these issues of forced labour. So moving on. And I won't go through all of these recommendations in detail. Suffice to say, we produced a couple of reports which really targeted recommendations to key stakeholder groups in the supply chain, looking at the roles of purchasing power of government to be leveraged more meaningfully to address labour issues. Crucially, a point about procurement organisations requiring evidence of forced labour diagnosis and remedy as a condition of contract. And then recommendations for manufacturers and workers regarding third-party expert support and the operation of grievance mechanisms. And then that final point about where there's persistent breach of contract over issues of forced labour, buyers really should be able to take action for financial or legal redress. So coming on further. So yeah, this is us, and you'll recognise some faces on the call this afternoon. But the team at Impact Limited with Rosie, including Emily Day and Ben Bostock, James Brown, who worked with me based at Newcastle, May and Alex, and then Mahmood Bhutta, who is an ENT surgeon based in Sussex, who is the founder of the British Medical Association's Medical Fair and Ethical Trade Group. So he's been that crucial link to the BMA and to the clinical sector. Just moving on. So you've heard from Olivia and Alex about the role of the Modern Slavery PEC, and they've been a wonderful partner in this research and through engagement, from start to finish. They've supported with drafts of reports. So Olivia mentioned the summary reports, and that's just our front cover there. We produced also a much longer and detailed report that extends to some 50 pages of rigorous and robust sort of evidence of forced labour. And that was targeted at multiple stakeholders in the supply chain, governmental organisations, commercial, civil society, workers themselves, advocates. And at this point, I would acknowledge also the involvement we had, participants in the research who we interviewed. I'm not saying as much about the research process, and also the advice and guidance of Andy Hall as a migrant workers' rights specialist, particularly on matters of local labour issues, and also the interviewers on the ground. Just moving on, I'm aware of time. The centerpiece of the project was a strong engagement with workers, and we conducted through Impact a survey of just under 1,500 workers in Malaysia, many of them migrant workers, supported by in-depth interviews as well to get at the lived experience, to get that snapshot in time of what was going on with working conditions during COVID-19 at its height. I know that the pandemic is far from over. And this is just an infographic that came out of that survey. So moving on, but at the point being that workers' experience was front and centre of this project. We disseminated through 4 workshops, with UK government departments. We're very grateful for that engagement and the Peck support in reaching them. Also a report launch organised by the British Medical Association. They produced a related report that's visualised here on the slide. At that time, reaching policymakers, government procurement managers, advocacy organisations. And then we also held workshops with some international government departments and also with suppliers who participated in the research. So that engagement was a deliberate strategy and was a key part of the project. And we actually have plans to take that further forward too. Just moving on. And then just I'll bring in Rosie at this point because timeliness has come up, and of course personal protective equipment, PPE, significantly in the spotlight over the last couple of years. Also some of the import bans from the US and Canada, where forced labour cases are found in this sector. So a lot of media attention. Our project did get some media coverage, and that timeliness has been critical. So just to briefly bring Rosie in at this point to say a few words on that.
Yes, absolutely. And those of us who've been working on this particular issue for some time, I think the timeliness of this research project has been tremendous for several reasons. I think that the broad-based collaboration, which Alex has been speaking about, meant that this evidence, rather than being a kind of minority or perhaps a particularly activist view, becomes a mainstream view and enables the direct communication of worker experience to policymakers. And I think that's extremely important. So I think the intervention of the Peck there in making this grant and then in facilitating much of the dissemination has been absolutely crucial. I think that the multidisciplinary nature of the team has also been extremely important when it comes to bridging the feasibility gap. Because I think because we have industry people and different types of academics and also a doctor on the team, the recommendations can be much more closely aligned with what is possible and to bridge that feasibility gap to some extent. But we have also been very lucky because of the shifting landscape, as Alex was saying, because whilst we were doing this work, a number of things happened. Because of the US government's strong moves against the rubber glove industry, particularly relating to some of the very largest players, which happened while this work was being done. This meant that there were many born people wanting to read the report, I think. The report also shows how the pressure from the US government has brought about a thing which nobody thought could happen, which is the mass repayment of tens of millions of US dollars of recruitment fees. So a real life impact on workers, which we were able to demonstrate through showing that debt bondage had reduced. And I think there we were able to show, because we were lucky with the timing actually, that it is possible to do some things about some of the hardest parts of this whole problem and some of the financial parts of this whole problem. So I think this combination of a broad-based collaboration, the mixture of voices, bridging the feasibility gap and the shifting landscape has absolutely played in our favour, and actually we should thank the Peck for this, because without the Peck we would all have been working in our own small corners in our own small way, and we wouldn't have been able to get all this together. That's kind of what I wanted to say. Alex, did you have any final hurrahs?
No, that's great, Rosie, thank you. And yeah, and once again acknowledging the support of the funding, which, as Alex and Olivia have explained, has gone way further than that in terms of support. And just to reiterate Rosie's comment there of thanks, yeah, we're really grateful. So we'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're on time as well, amazingly.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex and Rosie. We've been talking about the quality of timeliness, so you've demonstrated it brilliantly there. A really good case study of the system working. I'm particularly pleased to hear you talk about the effectiveness of the US import bans, because it's one of my frustrations in the UK context that the government keeps saying, well, we haven't ruled it in, we haven't ruled it out. But the point that you make about that money being repaid, and it's a significant amount of money to about 20,000 workers, isn't it, is a really good example, I think, of an effective policy. So let's hope our government have another look at it. So thank you very much to all the presenters. We've now got 5 panelists, and first panelist, Damian Johnston, who I think many of you will know is the Deputy Director in charge of most of the modern slavery unit at the Home Office, but he has other colleagues who work alongside him. And he's going to talk about the opportunity for maximising impact, particularly in terms of policy making. Damian, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Really nice to be here. I was just going to spend a few minutes and make sure I stick to time. Just talking about from a policy and strategy perspective, how sort of what we are trying to do when you're kind of working in government, trying to advise ministers on different ways to change our approach, adapt our approach and solve problems, and how from my perspective, research is critical to that and how it fits in. And then just finish with a bit of a sense of what we're currently sort of interested in from a research and evidence perspective. So with just a few thoughts, pausing briefly on kind of from a policy strategy maker's perspective, what are we trying to do? And it's trying to identify and articulate the different problems that we are trying to address, and what are the driving factors behind that? What is changing the landscape that was mentioned earlier? What is changing the context? What are the changing trends, macro trends that are impacting on the kind of the scale and prevalence and nature of modern slavery for this context that we're trying to deal with in a UK and an international context? What impact and outcomes should we be seeking to achieve that are feasible and practical? What are our options? What approaches might work? Given the resources that we would have or the levers that we have, which are the ones that might be most effective, and how can you link potential, where's the evidence on potential activity linked to outcomes, and how might that be? Clearly, in the context that I am at the moment, leading the strategy review into the government's modern slavery strategy, is what's going to make a difference at scale? So you can tinker around the edges with various different sub policies on victim identification, victim support, the law enforcement response, etc. But are there things that make a big difference? Are there things that have that impact at scale, particularly where we have a lever that we have influence over as government, or in partnership with others? So what is it that makes the partnerships work, whether it's with business, and I know Eric will be talking about that in a minute, but the partnership angle of this, and incentives to work together for impact. So from that perspective, the kind of the problem solving that we're trying to deal with, how does research fit into that? Well, it's critical to that. We are trying to fuse a lot of different evidence together: academic research, intelligence, assessment, analysis from internal to government, from other partners, as well as views from NGOs and civil society on what the problems are from their perspective and how we might address those. I mean, I would draw out all those things that mentioned about kind of relevance, digestibility, accessibility for policymakers, the policy impact. It's of those issues, whether it's the big picture stuff that you're researching or the kind of a specific policy problem, it's how, based on that evidence, what would you suggest the kind of solutions are? What levers that government or others have might have the most impact, and is there any evidence to kind of link cause and effect, even if it's kind of in a different context? Could we draw on something else? That's what really helps policymakers say to ministers, well, actually, we think of the three options, this actually with a bit of resource behind it might make the difference. I mean, I think just an aside, the project we just had a presentation on, again, I support all the things about relevance, the involvement of a wide range of different people in the research, including government officials, and then the way that was socialised afterwards, and sitting down talking with all sorts of different officials in the UK and overseas about the research outcomes is a fantastic kind of example of how you really build up awareness among policymakers of the issues and the problems and the potential solutions. And because it was focus on specific supply chain, again, there was a better understanding than we had had previously about sort of more general issues. So I think anything that points to what could be realistically achieved from the kind of levers that we have is always going to have a really positive informing of policy. And conscious of time, I'll leave on the kind of 30-second flavour of what we're sort of interested in. So, you know, at the big picture stuff, strategic levers, what will have most impact, as I mentioned, at scale, and is there evidence that supports those things we talked about? The import ban and those kind of measures and the kind of cause and effect there potentially. Those are always really interesting pieces of evidence if we can draw those links. Prevention, again, what works? If you can, the best thing for policymakers is if there's evidence that finally says these interventions actually work and there is evidence to underpin that. It makes it so much easier for us to argue the case to try and get the resources to do them. So what interventions work? What factors like supply chains, what factors make effective due diligence? What is it that's going to make it effective or less effective? Social auditing, etc. And you know, longer term outcomes of the support that we provide to victims, or the kind of how do you improve the outcomes going forward? I will stop there, but there's a kind of just a flavour of what it is from a policy perspective.
Damian, thank you for sharing your thoughts there. Our second research user is Eric Anderson, who's an independent business and human rights specialist. He's going to talk about the need of business when it comes to using research and evidence to inform practice. Eric, good to see you again. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm going to jump straight in and offer some observations about these business needs. So, I mean, firstly, for a business to perceive that they've got a need in this space assumes that they're actually engaging on modern slavery in the first place. But as we know, sadly, many businesses are not. And looking at the different potential reasons for that, I see some common engagement barriers that I actually think research has an opportunity to help overcome. The first one, in no order, is kind of this sense of disbelief that some business leaders have that modern slavery isn't happening in our business. It's happening somewhere else. It's somebody else's supply chain, somebody else's problem. And I think having research evidence that really shows the prevalence of the issue within their industry sector, in their region, in their locations where they operate can really help counter that sense of disbelief. Another one is kind of almost a sense of disgust that it's kind of PR madness to associate the brand of our business in any way with modern slavery. Why would you do that? And I think a good example of how gathering evidence around this is Know the Chain. So Know the Chain is doing great work, I think, on really making company efforts to be more transparent on the issues of modern slavery, putting those out in front and centre and really showing what's going on there. That breeds stakeholder trust in those businesses. It really does make a difference how you rank in those, and businesses need to know that the focus is on them in this way. Another one is kind of disengagement, this sense that modern slavery is not our responsibility to solve. It's way too big a problem for us as a business to engage in. It's just too big. And of course, that's wrong. Whether the business is caught by modern slavery disclosure legislation or not, chances are their stakeholders are going to be expecting them to deal with it. In fact, stakeholders expect all human rights to be respected. And in terms of issues, aspects of this that are too big to solve, I think the employer pays principle and the traction that's now getting with a lot of big businesses, global businesses, to drive on responsible recruitment being a priority issue. I think that's a great example of how evidence around that is increasingly being used by businesses. Another barrier is a sense of kind of disguise or downplay that some businesses might do, in that they know they've got a risk, but they don't yet have a handle on it. And until they do, they want to take kind of small tentative steps on the easier things to do rather than really grapple it and be bold. Here, I think research evidence on what best business practices are can really help focus them on their priority risks, material issues, and just encourage them to be really bold around taking action. Again, case studies from leading businesses and having the research community and the anti-slavery community celebrate the fact that these businesses are grappling with the hard challenges is something that will encourage and push back on this sense to downplay and disguise what's going on. And then maybe the final one that I see that's quite common is this sense of disconnect because of tick box thinking, this mentality that says, well, we manage the risk. We've got the code of conduct, we do due diligence, we train our people. Really, there's nothing much more we can do on this. And of course, that's wrong. There's always more to be done. And in fact, there's a strong expectation of continuous improvement baked into the Home Office guidance related to the Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. Personally, I think a great way to show improvement every year is to collaborate on research. If a business is looking for what they can do, getting involved in research is kind of an obvious plus in that respect. But for those businesses that are actually engaging, and in terms of what are their research needs, I echo a lot of what Juliana said in their excellent report. Some commonalities here. For me, what I see is the biggest need I hear from businesses is this desire to get really relevant, significant research to help them grapple with global supply chains. And it's a huge challenge. It's one of the reasons why it's a priority research area for the Commissioner's Office, but also Modern Slavery Policy Evidence Centre. They've put out that responsive call for research in September. I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes back from that. There is a real need for that to be relevant. This practical relevance issue for business research is critical, because if it's just pitched too high or slightly to left, it's really got to nail what the gaps of these businesses are trying. What's the gaps in their understanding? What are they really trying to do? So relevance is a real issue. But I think one of the things that the research community can do to help on that is really target businesses at the design stage of the research to get their input, to get their thoughts on how to best shape this so that it is relevant for them when the findings come out. And then, of course, to target those findings once you have them, to go back to those businesses and say, this is what we found, is really important. Because there is, and this is my last point really, there's low awareness that relevant research actually exists on this in businesses. They don't really know where to go to look for it. So I think we do have a collective challenge to make it super simple for businesses to really self-serve the relevant research that they think they need to make progress on this issue. So I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Eric. Lots of good points there. I completely agree with you that the biggest issue is about how to help business around complex, lengthy global supply chains. But I also thought the point you made about the reluctance of business to connect their name in any way with modern slavery is something that I regularly encounter, and I think it's a really powerful point. So we're now going to move to the three panelists who are going to comment a little bit about barriers to impact and barriers to research. First one, the second time today. Hello, Debbie, great to see you. Debbie Ariel is the Chief Executive of Afruca. She's going to talk a little bit about the barriers to inclusive and diverse research and some practical steps to overcome them. But so good afternoon, Debbie.
Good afternoon, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me to join the panel, and thank you for putting this event together. I just want to highlight, for those who don't know, excuse me, that Afruca runs a network called the UK BME Anti-Slavery Network. And we did this towards the tail end of 2019. We have about 60 members who are small BME charities working in anti-slavery, but also we have some academics and researchers, survivors and observers. So the work that Bastard has been doing has been around how to help improve equality, diversity and inclusion in our sector. So in July this year, we launched a UK action plan for the sector to promote race equality, diversity and inclusion. And modern slavery and human trafficking research was one of the 9 core themes that we identified in our action plan as requiring improvement. We identified a number of key issues where such improvements are needed, and we also came up with some recommendations and other areas of interest. So I want to highlight some of those issues that we identified in our action plan. Firstly, that modern slavery and human trafficking research and evaluation is insufficiently informed by people affected by modern slavery, including people from ethnic minority communities. And that's really important because if we're not including the people who are actually affected by these issues in the work that we're doing as part of our research, we will not be able to capture their experiences. I will obviously not be able to, have very good outcomes in terms of the way forward. So, I mean, a good example of this, I'll talk to you. We've been funded by Peck in partnership with the University of Sheffield and the West Midlands Modern Slavery Network to carry out a prevention project in relation to sexual exploitation and labor exploitation. We had a group of survivors in the room that took part in the consultative panel, and an issue came up in relation to the issuing of telephones, mobile phones, smartphones to survivors during COVID. And the idea really was to help survivors to be able to communicate with the outside world during COVID. And from the distance, this looked like a very good and laudable project. However, we talked to our survivors about this issue, and they were actually able to draw out the numerous dangers and risks that this particular initiative could have on victims and survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. They stated that there was the possibility of re-exploitation by either their perpetrators or even new perpetrators, because survivors were talking to people online. There was no guidelines, there was no protection for them, and also that this could actually intensify their mental health and trauma through various mediums, and so on and so forth. And I guess the issue in using this as a case study, as an example here, was that had it been that we had taken the time to talk to survivors about giving them smartphones, it may be that they will have been able to help us to decide whether actually this was, on the balance of probability, a very good thing to do, rather than just make the decision for them, because we believe that this would be the best for them, right? So I think the issue of survivor engagement and community engagement in research is extremely crucial. The lack of diversity among research participants has serious ethical and research consequences. So this includes impeding the ability to generalize study results, the ability to make appropriate services like I just talked about, and so on and so forth. And we believe that the strict bureaucratic procedures of ticking boxes when it comes to research could have implications for people with lived experiences, i.e. survivors, as well as the practical knowledge and experience of grassroots organizations through collaboration to effectively inform research. So we recognize as part of our action plan that the MSPEC, the Modern Slavery Policy Evidence Center, has a key role to play in helping to change the status quo. So we've been working quite closely with MSPEC to change these narratives. So we've done at least two things with them. Firstly, is in terms of informing their own EDI, i.e. the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan, and also their research audit. And one of the outcomes is that I think is the reformulation of the research application processes to ensure that data about research staff, i.e. the collaborators and researchers, is collated at the very early stage. So when you're applying for research funding, you're actually able to make it known the ethnic backgrounds of the people who are taking part in your research project. We are also working with the University of Sheffield on an MS Peck funded research project on modern slavery prevention. I think I mentioned that earlier. And the good thing about this is we're able to bring on board our members, the small BME organizations who form members of BASNet, and also survivors as participants, which means that for the first time, in my viewpoint, we have people who live experiences and affected communities able to inform the research process in terms of modern slavery and human trafficking. We've shared broader recommendations and indicators of progress to help improve the MS-HT research landscape in our action plan. And you can please download a copy of our action plan on our website at bmeantislavery.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Debbie. Now, our next panelist is Abby, who is a project officer in my own office, and she's going to just share about her work that she's doing examining mental health support for victims and survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. Abby, over to you. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Like Sarah mentioned, my name is Abigail Legway. I prefer Abby. I am the project officer at the Commissioner's Office, and I'm doing an internship program with the office for 40 days. The purpose of my role is to work on a survival-informed research project. Now, this project, I have developed a project which will look into at a question, which is as victims and survivors of modern day slavery within the national referral mechanism provided with mental health support that is appropriate to their needs. Now, the aim of this project is to look at whether victims and survivors of modern day slavery are provided or rather are able to access mental health support that are appropriate to their needs. Also, whether the mental health support they are provided with is culturally sensitive and to what extent this is important to survivors. Now, this is important to project because as a survivor myself, I do understand and I do have a first-hand experience on the various barriers that we often face when accessing mental health support. From experience, I do know that there is a gap and in understanding the barriers that survivors or victims of are faced with, especially seeing it from their own point of view. So also, I feel, or I do believe that there is a lack or little has been done about ensuring that the mental health support provided for survivors is culturally sensitive and trauma informed to ensure that their needs are met. So to achieve this, I will be doing a desk-based research, examining mental health support for survivors that's already out there. Also, I will be analyzing data from the WOMEX1 project from the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. And currently, we are running an insight survey. You know, this is to gather information and also the viewpoint of the survivors on the mental health support that they receive and how far this was culturally sensitive to them. So what the findings from these areas will be written up into a report, and this report will be published on the Commissioner's Office. Lastly, if anyone here is interested in participating in this survey, please do so. It's right till the end of this week. Yeah, till the end of this week. The survey is still till the end of this week, so it will be closing by Friday, 26th of November. So please do participate, and the survey is available at the Commissioner's office. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, that's great, Abby. And our last panellist is Catherine Hutchinson, who is from the Cabinet Office, where she holds the role of the head of the Evaluation Task Force, and she's looking particularly at the role of the task force and will comment, I think, about evidence use across government. Catherine, you're very welcome. Catherine, we're really struggling to hear what you're saying. We've probably got about 1 word in 4.
I hope the 1 word in 4 was evaluation.
So
can you hear me now?
It is slightly better. Do you want to have one more go? But it's been pretty bad. And I don't think you
I know I've also had it bad listening to it as well. So, okay. So I don't know where it cut off, but essentially Cabinet Office for political push, Treasury for the money push. And together we're trying to make sure that all of the choices in government in terms of how to spend the very limited resources we have are being informed by the best available evidence, because there's a gap between the best possible way of spending that money and what we're doing right now. And that gap basically needs to be informed by evidence, because at the moment, quite a lot of very important areas, we just don't know what the right thing to do is. So for me and my team, we're trying to push the incentives, push departmental spend, try to encourage and incentivize the correct use of evidence. And in most cases, that's just what the best available is. We're not expecting a big, large trial for everything, but actually what the best available evidence is to be able to shorten that gap. And also evidence, I guess people are always looking about solutions, but for me as well, evidence really helps us define what the problem is. So helps us understand what the issues are that we're tackling. Because a lot of people might actually think that one thing is a particular way, but when you start to unpick what the issues are, you realize they're much more complex, or you realize there are other drivers, or you realize actually the issue is something different. So that for me is a real nutshell of what we're doing, that essentially evaluation has never been more important in government, because we have now got the creation of a task force. We've got lots of incentives, lots of pushes, lots of drivers to get evidence used. There is a significant gap between what we are spending in terms of outcomes we think we should be having and what we're actually delivering. And there are lots of opportunities and other ways we can influence. So I would strongly encourage people to try to consider the broadest possible approaches to evaluation, to understanding some of the biggest policy challenges we've got, because we just can't afford not to. There's too much money and people time being spent in areas we just don't know the impact.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed, and I'm sorry if the problem was at our end, but you make a very, very strong case for the use of evidence and evaluation, which perfectly complements what we've been arguing. Now, Jessica, are you in a position to give us the Q&A results before we go to the questions that I've got here?
Yes, let me try and share those now.
Okay.
So you can all see them.
So access, 49%, feasibility, 24%, funding, 38%, preconceptions, 24%, relevance, 35%, time, 22%. So access appears to be the most important. Okay, thank you very much for that. That's really kind of useful for us. So what I'm going to do now, if people can look at the Q&A, and if my panelists can maybe put their cameras back on, there's a couple here about survivor inclusion and gathering data from survivors, asking whether it makes it maybe easier if that's done online. Alex or Debbie, do you have any thoughts about that in terms of methodology?
I could answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, we did a session with our survivors about a couple of weeks ago as part of the prevention research project with University of Sheffield. You know, it was a consultative meeting, and it was done via Zoom. And it worked very well because we were able to, get them to hide their identity. We could only hear their voices, and that really worked well in terms of anonymity, but also in terms of obviously protection and confidentiality. So, I think either way, as long as we ensure the protection of the identity of the young people, well, I say young people because we're young people, of the survivors that we're working with, I think whichever way we do it, it's okay.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to bring Rosie in a minute, but I forgot to say we've also been joined by Dr. May Truber and Dr. Alex Troutrims, who both worked on the Malaysian Glove project as well. So Alex, were you about to say something as well?
No, I was just about to apologise. I wasn't sure which Alex you meant, and whether it was me or Alex Troutrims or Alex Belch even. So apologies for that. But I think Rosie wants to come in, so I'll
okay. Go on, Rosie. I was meaning Alex Belch, by the way, but you're right. There are 3 Alexes. Clearly a very popular name at a certain point in time. Rosie.
Yes, I was quickly going to say that we spend a lot of our time talking to very vulnerable people, and we were at first worried that the epidemic would mean that we wouldn't be able to reach them anymore because of not being able to get face-to-face. We've actually found, I think we've probably interviewed about 15,000 people at risk or in forced labour over the period, and we actually find that survivors tend to build trust more easily over online tools than face-to-face. And certainly when it comes to discussing extremely sensitive issues, for example, around sexual abuse or things like gay sexual abuse in Muslim communities and things like that, we actually find that people feel more comfortable and give more information, which has been an unexpected learning that we've had.
Brilliant, thanks, Rosie. Now, we've got very good panelists who are already writing responses. So, Alex, do you want to, could you just tell us the response you've typed in on the issue about sluggish processes around ethical approval?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is a really common issue and something that I've come across a lot and I sympathise with. But I mean, obviously, there's no substitute for gaining ethical approval, but there are lots of ways you can improve the efficiency of the process. And I would just recommend that you get a good working relationship with the people who run the ethics committee, particularly the chair, but also the people who help support the chair, because sometimes it isn't appropriate to get 15 different ethics committee approvals. It's just not proportionate. If you're doing an interview in one country or in 10 countries, do you need to get 10 local approvals? Probably not. So there are ways around most questions that are proportionate and still maintaining the highest possible standards. And I do think sometimes it's just about better communication with your ethics team. Sounds like an easy thing to say, but that is my experience.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Now we've got a question from Joe Wilding for Damian. Have you seen this question, Damian? Do you want to have a go at answering that?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, look, there's been a lot of questions about the angle being taken in the Nationality and Borders Bill. But the government published on gov.uk in March some evidence around what people have been facing return immigration detention had been raising as issues. The government is concerned about the rise in the number of referrals, the number of late referrals for people in immigration detention for immigration offences, and it's been quite a significant rise in the last couple of years. And so they've got concerns about whether there is something behind that in terms of misusing the system to frustrate their people's return. So that is partly it that those things are based on. I mean, is there any realistic way to kind of get into that? I mean, we've been looking at those issues. Ministers want to get into that, and they think certainly some of the clauses in the bill are about just ensuring that we focus the resources on genuine victims and make sure that we have an ability to understand where there may be fraudulent claims in the system. It isn't in any way suggesting that the majority of victims are not victims. So we're going through the same processes that we do in general, but that's kind of where the government is coming from on the evidence that it's got.
Thanks, Damian. Now, Lisa's asked a question about methods, which May had a go at answering, and I think, Alex, are you typing an answer? So do you both want to have a quick go at it verbally as well? May, maybe first?
Yes, sorry. Hi. I don't think any methods it's is relevant and important. I'm a labor anthropologist myself, so I'm a qualitative researcher. The project on globs, we did mixed methods. We did the survey, quantitative data, and we also use qualitative data from the survey. As far the most important thing is that they respond to specific questions, that the methods are fit for purpose according to the research aim, but any methodology is equally important, I think.
Thanks, May. And Alex has clarified, but it's that similar point about appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would say exactly the same thing. I suppose the additional point I just want to make is that too often I think methods are not given enough prominence in the actual write-up. So we don't talk maybe clearly enough about what the methods are, explaining them, maybe assuming people understand jargon around methods. And I think for policymakers in particular, it's really, really useful if we can sort of find really good ways to explain what the methods are, why they're important, and what value they bring, because they all bring different things. And I think sometimes they're skated over a little bit in the sort of service of brevity and trying to just make things easier to read. But actually, I do think we should spend a bit more time explaining them to other audiences.
Particularly if we're making the argument that this evidence and research should be taken note of, its integrity and methodology becomes even more important, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now we've got a question from Frank Hansen, which is an interesting one about how can we better standardise help and support for victims whose experience of exploitation falls short of modern slavery. I guess that's probably a whole research area, but I suspect it's Frank from the GLAA, I might be wrong there. But it's this point that they often come across people where the threshold isn't there for referral into the national referral mechanism and slavery, but there are certainly issues of exploitation. Any thoughts of that as an issue and whether it is a kind of research gap from anybody? I mean, Olivia, is that something you could have a go at from your background? Or anybody else, please raise your hand.
I'll try and have a go, Sarah. I think one thing which I noted just before this webinar started was that the Office of the Director for Labour Market Enforcement have begun pre-market engagement for procuring a research project to better understand the scale and nature of labour market non-compliance across the UK. And I think that will be a really valuable insight into what is going on across that full spectrum or continuum, as it's sometimes described, from kind of non-payment of national minimum wage at one end through to modern slavery and forced labour at the other end. So I think that will be a really important piece of the puzzle. The other thing that I would flag is that within the Modern Slavery PEC, we've recently launched an open call for research proposals to ask the question, how do wider legal and policy frameworks outside of modern slavery, so how do things like regulation of the labour market, regulation of the immigration system, how do they actually intersect with modern slavery, and what are the opportunities to better design those wider policies to improve outcomes on modern slavery? So again, I'm hopeful that there'll be some interesting research through that call, which will help to unpick some of that relationship between labour exploitation and modern slavery. So I think that's my way of saying lots of research on the way on this question, but one that feels quite difficult to answer at this point in time.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. And I would agree with you that it is a gap, and it's great to see the Director of Labour Market Enforcement getting involved in this issue. It reminds me, Alex Hughes, of the fact that on your Malaysian glove work, you looked at those 11 ILO indicators and that you found them all present. I think that's kind of really an interesting way to go when you start looking at these issues, the indicators of forced labour. Would anybody have a go at Jack Barrett's question, which is about engaging with survivors and any general advice to ensure that it's safe and positive for everybody who's involved? Would anybody like to have a go at trying to answer that? Go on, Debbie.
Yeah, this is just a short narrative in response to that. We had a meeting of some journalists and some of our survivors about a couple of weeks ago. They were interested in conducting a BBC program on survivors, but they hadn't thought through how they were going to work with survivors. And that was very obvious from the questions that the survivors were asking them around confidentiality, around privacy, around trauma-informed support, should in case some issues come up that will help make them to relieve their negative experiences. You know, so I guess all these issues come up. If you're going to be working with survivors, you need to understand that your questioning or your questions can actually you know, spur negative memories, and it's important to have help and support available already for survivors to be able to help them, you know, to deal with those issues. Of course, confidentiality is always an issue, as well as
so. Thank you. Oh, is Debbie frozen for everybody? Okay, so thanks, Debbie. Rosie, have you got your hand up for this question as well, please?
Yes, I have. I was just going to say, I completely agree with what Debbie was saying. I think that the other thing, there's two other factors for me. One is the way that questions are asked. It's very important to use a kind of appreciative inquiry style and not have people necessarily couch their experience in terms of modern slavery, because it's a terrible thing to have to admit that it's happened to you. So I think it's very important to respect the way that people want to speak about this and to use appreciative inquiry techniques which endorse the speaker at every turn. That's the first thing. The second, and then actually when you do that, sometimes people actually feel a sense of enhanced respect because they've been asked to talk, you know, as human to human about these things. So there can be some positive psychological effects. The other thing, of course, is access to remedy and access to victim or survivor-centered remedy, which of course is not always within the purview of a researcher. This is why this can be so difficult. And again, I would really, really encourage people to work in partnership so that they can at least ensure that there's an element of case management that comes out of the questioning.
Okay, great, thank you for those. And I'm really pleased to see, I think it's Rose Broad responding to Frank, and there's been a nice conversation in the chat putting researchers at Manchester University in touch with the GLAA, which is great. We've then got Glenn Miles is asking a similar question, I think, to an anonymous attendee, which is about the potential for more longitudinal research, particularly working with grassroots organisations and universities. Is that part of the plan, Alex Balch at the MS Peck?
Yeah, I mean, one of the priorities that we were told about and, you know, came through loud and clear in our consultation was longer term outcomes. Actually, it's something I think policymakers have also highlighted. So, you know, it's no good having snapshot research. We need to understand the longer term outcomes, and we need to repeat our research, particularly if it's looking at something such as how survivors recover. You know, that can't just be something you do once. It has to be something you build in. So I would sort of emphasize here the blurred line between research and then monitoring and evaluation of policy impact. So you've got a sort of a need to not just do single pieces of research, but to actually build in sort of research questions into all processes. And yeah, but that's not to diminish what a mountain it is to climb, to try and provide long-term longitudinal research in this area. It's, you know, because the funding, even the Peck has only got 5 years of funding. Sounds like a long time, but you know, we need 10 years, 15 years to really see, the real evidence about long-term outcomes. So absolutely something we're thinking about, but a bit of a mountain to climb in order to achieve really long-term research.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Now, I see my friend Paul Rigby is concerned about some Guardian reporting about research not being published. I'm not sure that Damian's able to answer that question, but I note it, Paul, and I think it just raises the importance of, certainly within this community, of integrity, of the importance of publication, and the importance of kind of objective open inquiry. There's one interesting point from Robert Whitfield in the chat about the legal fraternity interface. Not quite joint presentations. Has anybody got any thoughts? Are you doing any work in the Peck in terms of the legal fraternity? This is going to be the last quick question. Anybody want to go on that? I'm just thinking about the big call that you've just done, the open call, Alex and Olivia. Isn't that looking at some of the legal constructs as well?
It is, yeah, and we are working with lawyers actually all the time, partly because one of our partners is based in the law faculty, Bonavera Institute of Human Rights, but also our work strand with University of Hull is about legal enforcement. So that does involve working with lawyers, and they do have a different way of thinking about evidence, obviously, because it's sort of part of their job. So we do sometimes have to sort of adjust our jargon when we speak and work with lawyers. But we are doing evidence reviews based on case law. And yeah, absolutely, we need to think more carefully about how we work with the legal profession, not least because of the, the importance of improving decision-making and outcomes for victims in court cases. So there's all sorts of reasons why we need to improve that work. But there is a different perspective on research and evidence, which we sometimes need to bridge.
Okay, lovely. Thank you all very much to all our speakers and all our panelists. This has been a very rich conversation. I think things are improving, they're moving on. Let's hope if we do this again in 12 months' time, we'll be able to report more progress. But thank you for your participation. Thank you those who've been listening and sending in good questions and comments, and good afternoon to you all.